April 30th, 1945, 3:30 p.m. Deep beneath the ruins of the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, Adolf Hitler placed a Walther PPK 7.65mm pistol to his right temple and pulled the trigger. His wife of less than 40 hours, Eva Braun, bit down on a cyanide capsule beside him. The man who had promised a 1,000-year Reich was dead, and with him died any illusion that Nazi Germany could survive. But above ground, in the shattered streets of Berlin, nearly 3 million civilians had no idea their Führer was gone. For them, the nightmare was just beginning. This is the story of what those Berliners said, did, and endured during the 48 hours between Hitler's death and the surrender of their city. A story of suicide waves, chaos, terror, and the desperate struggle to survive in a dying capital. The city on the brink, April 30th, morning. Let's rewind to the morning of April 30th. Berlin was a city in its death throes. For 10 days, Soviet artillery had been pounding the capital without mercy. The bombardment that began on April 20th, Hitler's 56th birthday, delivered more explosive tonnage than all the Western Allied bombing raids combined. The sound was so intense that houses shook violently in the eastern suburbs. Pictures fell from walls, and telephones rang on their own from the vibrations. Over 2.5 million Soviet troops had encircled the city. They outnumbered Berlin's defenders by at least 5-1. The defending force was a patchwork of desperation. Regular Wehrmacht units that still had any cohesion, foreign SS volunteers, and tens of thousands of Volkssturm militia made up of old men and teenage boys. Some Hitler Youth battalions sent into battle had an average age of just 14 years old. The civilian population was trapped. Hitler had forbidden any evacuation of Berlin's residents. 3 million people remained in a city where 90% of the buildings in the center had been destroyed by years of Allied bombing. By April 30th, the city's infrastructure had completely collapsed. There was no electricity, no gas, no running water in most areas. The sewage system had failed. Bodies of dead horses littered the streets, and hungry Berliners cut meat from the carcasses despite the stench and the danger. A German colonel described the Soviet bombardment as a dull, continuous roar of thunder from the east. On ration lines, when they still existed, women and girls listened in dread to the distant sounds of the front, asking each other if the Americans would reach Berlin before the Soviets. They already knew the answer: life underground. Tens of thousands of Berliners had retreated underground, seeking shelter in basements, bunkers, and U-Bahn stations. The city had built massive flak towers, concrete fortresses with walls up to 3.5 meters thick. The Zoo Tower, one of the largest, could theoretically shelter 10,000 people. By the final days of April, up to 30,000 Berliners had crammed into that single structure. Conditions in these shelters were unbearable. The air was thick and hard to breathe. Water was scarce. People were packed so tightly that movement was nearly impossible. In the Zoo Tower, civilians lived alongside wounded soldiers, Nazi officials who refused to flee, and priceless art treasures from Berlin's museums, including the Nefertiti bust and pieces of the Pergamon altar. Below the Reich Chancellery, in the Führer bunker itself, Hitler spent his final hours. The bunker complex consisted of 18 rooms on 2 levels, located 55 feet beneath the garden of the old Reich Chancellery. But despite its reinforced concrete roof, up to 13 feet thick, conditions were miserable. The bunker sat below the water table, making it perpetually damp. Pumps ran continuously to remove groundwater. The air was stale and oppressive. Throughout Berlin, similar scenes played out in hundreds of cellars and shelters. Families huddled together, listening to the sounds of battle growing closer. Soviet shells exploded overhead. The building shook with each impact. Children cried. Adults tried to maintain some sense of normalcy, but fear permeated every breath. Many Berliners had not seen sunlight in weeks. They emerged only when absolutely necessary, to search for food or water. The city's 17 breweries, declared essential by government decree, incredibly continued making beer through the battle. The meteorological station in Potsdam maintained its daily weather reports without missing a single day throughout 1945. These absurd pieces of normalcy existed alongside absolute chaos. The morning of April 30th. On the morning of April 30th, Soviet forces were less than 500 meters from the Führer bunker. Red Army soldiers had been fighting their way through the government district, advancing building by building, often in hand-to-hand combat. German defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew defeat meant death or Siberian labor camps. In the bunker, Hitler received devastating news from Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel. All the forces Hitler had been counting on to rescue Berlin had either been encircled or forced onto the defensive. General Helmut Weidling, commander of the Berlin defense area, told Hitler that the garrison would likely run out of ammunition that very night. The fighting would end within 24 hours. Hitler had spent the previous day preparing for death. On April 29th, he had married Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony. He dictated his will and political testament to his secretary, Traudl Junge, naming Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor. He ordered his bodyguards to destroy his personal papers. He had his dog Blondie and Eva Braun's spaniel poisoned by one of his doctors. In the afternoon of April 29th, Hitler went room to room in the bunker, shaking hands with staff members, offering a few words of encouragement. Everyone who saw him noted his appearance. He shuffled rather than walked. His left hand trembled constantly. His face was pale and gaunt. Some accounts suggest Eva Braun was heard crying, saying she would rather die there than try to escape. At around 2:30 a.m. on April 30th, Hitler appeared in the corridor where about 20 people had assembled, mostly women, to say their final farewells. He went down the line, shaking each person's hand and speaking briefly with them before returning to his quarters. Above ground, civilians knew nothing of this drama, but they could feel that something fundamental was ending. Soviet artillery fire intensified throughout the day. The sounds of fighting, already close, seemed to be moving toward the very heart of the government district. The afternoon, Hitler's death. At approximately 3:30 p.m. on April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide in Hitler's private sitting room. Hitler shot himself in the right temple. Eva bit into a cyanide capsule. Their bodies were found shortly after by Hitler's valet, Heinz Linge, and other staff members. The bodies were carried through the bunker's emergency exit into the Reich Chancellery garden. There, in a shell crater, Hitler and Braun's corpses were doused with gasoline and set on fire. The smell of burning flesh mixed with the acrid smoke already filling Berlin's air from countless fires. The bodies burned while Soviet artillery shells continued to fall around the Chancellery. The cremation was never complete. Hitler's funeral pyre, as Winston Churchill would later write, made a lurid end of the Third Reich. Word of Hitler's death spread quickly through the bunker. Within minutes, people in the underground complex knew their Führer was dead. The reaction was mixed. Some went into shock. Others felt relief. Random gunshots echoed through the bunker complex as officers facing a bleak future in Soviet hands took their own lives immediately upon hearing the news. For those Nazis who had believed in final victory, who had convinced themselves that some miracle would save Germany, the news came as a devastating blow. For others who could see reality, clearly Hitler's death brought a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that the madness might finally end, fear of what came next, hopelessness about their own futures, and for many, a crushing sense of defeat. But the civilians of Berlin, hiding in their cellars and shelters, knew none of this yet. They continued waiting, hoping to survive one more day, one more hour. He, Nazi propaganda machine, responds. Hitler's death created an immediate problem for the remaining Nazi leadership. How would they tell the German people? How would they frame this moment to serve their purposes even as everything collapsed? Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary and head of the party chancellery, sent a cryptic radio message to Admiral Dönitz sometime between 6:15 and 7:50 p.m. on April 30th. The message, transmitted in secure naval cipher, announced that Dönitz had been appointed to replace Göring, but it deliberately avoided mentioning that Hitler was dead. Bormann seemed to want to extend his own authority for as long as possible. It was not until the evening of May 1st, more than 24 hours after Hitler's death, that the German public learned their Führer was gone. The announcement came via Reichssender Hamburg, the last functional shortwave transmitter in Germany. An announcer's voice broke into regular programming with the news. The propaganda lie was immediate and blatant. The radio announcement declared that Hitler had fallen fighting to his last breath against Bolshevism at his command post in the Reich Chancellery. The announcement portrayed Hitler as a hero who died in battle, a warrior who fell defending Berlin from the Soviet hordes. It was pure fiction, but it served the Nazi narrative. Admiral Dönitz himself then spoke to the German people. His voice, solemn and measured, told them that their Führer Adolf Hitler had fallen. He described Hitler's death as a hero's death in the capital of the German Reich. He said Hitler's life had been one single service for Germany. He claimed Hitler had recognized early the frightful danger of Bolshevism and dedicated his existence to fighting it. Then Dönitz made a crucial announcement. The war would continue. He vowed to save Germans from destruction by the Bolshevist enemy. He said German forces would fight on as long as British and Americans impeded this goal. The war was not over. The dying would continue. The British Broadcasting Corporation's monitoring service picked up the German announcement. Within minutes, the BBC interrupted its regular programming. Stuart Hibberd, the BBC's chief announcer, came on air with a news flash, a term the BBC rarely used. "This is London calling," he said. "Here is a news flash. The German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead. I will repeat that. The German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead." In London, New York, and Moscow, the announcement generated reactions ranging from jubilation to skepticism to calculated political maneuvering. Berlin civilians hear the news. In Berlin, the announcement reached civilians in fragments. Some had working radios and heard the broadcast directly. Others learned from soldiers. Still others heard nothing and remained ignorant for days. Judah Petinati, a young Berliner who had taken shelter in the basement of a university near the Wilhelmstrasse, remembered the moment clearly decades later. On the afternoon of May 1st, some soldiers finally dared to walk out into the yard. The sun was shining, as if it didn't care for all the chaos on Earth, she recalled. Suddenly, another soldier came running from the direction of the Reichskanzlei, Hitler's chancellery, shouting, "The Führer is dead! The war is over!" How this soldier knew remained a mystery to her, as the official announcement came later, but the word spread regardless. The Führer is dead. The war is over. Yet the war continued. The shooting continued. People continued dying. For many Berliners, Hitler's death meant little in practical terms. Historian Ian Kershaw noted that, by this stage, Hitler had largely passed out of the view of most of the population. Their interest was taken up completely by matters that concerned them directly. For them, Hitler was simply a symbol of the desperate continuation of a long-since-lost war. The reaction among Berlin civilians varied dramatically. Some who had been true believers in National Socialism felt genuine grief. They had invested their entire worldview in Hitler and the Nazi ideology. His death shattered their sense of meaning and purpose. Others felt relief. Perhaps now the madness would end. Perhaps now the killing would stop. Perhaps German forces would finally surrender, and this nightmare would be over. These hopes would prove largely unfounded. Many felt nothing at all about Hitler personally. They were too consumed with immediate survival. Where would they find food? Was the water in that shell crater safe to drink? Would Soviet soldiers break into their cellar? Would they survive the next artillery barrage? Hitler's death was abstract compared to these visceral, immediate terrors. For Nazi officials and military officers, Hitler's death triggered a wave of suicides. They understood what Soviet capture would mean: show trials, execution, or at best, decades in Siberian labor camps. Some chose death over that fate, the suicide epidemic. What happened next was unprecedented in German history. A wave of suicides swept through Berlin and across Germany that dwarfed anything seen before or since. The statistics are staggering and deeply disturbing. In Berlin alone, more than 7,000 suicides were reported in 1945, though the true number was likely much higher due to chaos and lack of record-keeping. In April 1945, during the Battle of Berlin, 3,081 people killed themselves. That is over 29 suicides per day, or more than 5 every hour throughout the worst of the fighting. These numbers represented a 5-fold increase over normal peacetime suicide rates. The suicides followed patterns. Nazi officials and military officers killed themselves immediately upon hearing of Hitler's death. In the bunker itself, gunshots rang out as people chose death over capture. General Hans Krebs and General Wilhelm Burgdorf sat side by side and shot themselves with their Luger pistols. Early on May 2nd, Captain Franz Schädli, commander of Hitler's personal guard in the bunker, also took his own life. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, committed suicide on May 1st, one day after Hitler. But first, Goebbels and his wife Magda murdered their 6 children. They had the children drugged, then gave them crushed cyanide tablets. The children, ranging in age from 4 to 12, died in their beds in the bunker. Only then did Joseph and Magda Goebbels take their own lives. This act of murder-suicide was not unique. Across Berlin, parents killed their children and then themselves. The scale of these family suicides shocked even hardened Soviet soldiers when they discovered the bodies. Mothers pulled their children into rivers to drown. Fathers shot their families before turning weapons on themselves. Entire households took poison together. The motivations were complex and varied. Fear of Soviet revenge was paramount. Nazi propaganda had spent years telling Germans about Soviet atrocities. Stories of mass rape, torture, and execution were not entirely propaganda. They had basis in reality, as we will discuss. Many German families believed death was preferable to falling into Soviet hands. For committed Nazis, Hitler's death removed any sense of meaning or future. If Hitler was dead and the Reich had failed, what was the point of continuing? Their entire worldview collapsed. Some saw suicide as a final act of loyalty to Hitler and Nazi ideology. Nazi propaganda had glorified the idea of heroic death. In a radio speech in February 1945, Goebbels declared that if Germany were defeated, he would cheerfully throw away his life, as Cato the Younger did. Hitler himself, in a 1939 speech, had proclaimed his preference for death over defeat. This rhetoric created an atmosphere where suicide seemed not just acceptable, but noble. The German newspaper Völkischer Beobachter published an article on March 28, 1945, titled "Risk of One's Life," calling on Germans to fight to the death rather than surrender. On April 12, 1945, members of the Hitler Youth distributed cyanide pills to audience members during the last concert of the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra. The message was clear: death before defeat. But it was not just committed Nazis who killed themselves. Ordinary Germans, facing an uncertain and terrifying future, also chose suicide. They feared Soviet revenge. They feared rape. They feared starvation. They feared losing everything. Many simply saw no future worth living for. In the town of Demmin, northeast of Berlin, up to 1,000 people killed themselves in early May 1945. The town had been abandoned by Nazi officials, police, and Wehrmacht forces. When Soviet troops arrived on May 1st, some German snipers and Hitler Youth opened fire. In retaliation, Soviet forces conducted widespread looting, executions, and mass rape over the following days. The suicides in Demmin occurred in 2 waves. The first came immediately before the Soviets arrived, driven by fear and Nazi propaganda. The second, larger wave came after Soviet troops entered the town, and the reality of occupation became clear. Families walked together to the rivers that bounded the town. Mothers tied stones to their children and themselves, then walked into the water. Bodies hung from trees throughout the forests around Demmin. Entire families took poison together. This was not murder. It was not insanity. It was a calculated response to unbearable circumstances and genuine fears. The suicide epidemic represented a final, desperate assertion of control in a world that had become uncontrollable. Soviet forces enter Berlin proper. While Hitler's death and the subsequent suicides unfolded, Soviet forces continued their relentless advance. By April 30th, multiple Soviet armies were fighting in Berlin itself. The Third Shock Army drove toward the Reichstag. The 8th Guards Army advanced from the south. The 1st Guards Tank Army surrounded remaining German strongpoints. The fighting was brutal and personal. Soviet troops had fought their way across Eastern Europe, through Poland, East Prussia, and finally into Germany itself. They had seen what the Germans did in the Soviet Union. They had liberated death camps. They had found Soviet villages burned and their populations massacred. Many had lost family members to German brutality. Now they were in the enemy's capital, and the desire for revenge burned hot. Soviet artillery could depress their guns and fire directly into buildings at point-blank range. A single sniper shot could provoke an artillery barrage that leveled an entire structure. If Soviet forces suspected a cellar contained German defenders, they tossed in grenades without checking for civilians first. The street fighting was savage. German defenders, knowing capture meant death or Siberia, fought with desperate ferocity. Hitler Youth, armed with Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets, ambushed Soviet tanks. One account describes 3 German defenders, armed only with a machine gun, holding off Soviet attacks on the Helensee Bridge for 2 days straight. But German resistance, no matter how brave or desperate, was futile. The Soviets had overwhelming numbers, unlimited ammunition, and total air superiority. Every German strongpoint that fell meant Soviet forces moved closer to the bunker, closer to the government district, closer to victory. By the afternoon of April 30th, the same time Hitler was dying, Soviet forces were fighting for control of the Moltke Bridge over the Spree River. The bridge was barricaded, mined, and covered by machine guns and artillery. At 6 p.m., the Germans attempted to blow it up. The explosives failed to completely destroy the bridge. It sagged, but remained passable to infantry. Soviet troops stormed across under withering fire, with artillery firing at the defenders at point-blank range. The Reichstag falls. The Reichstag building had not been used as a parliament since 1933, when it was damaged by fire. Hitler had abandoned it as a functioning building, but Stalin was obsessed with capturing it. For the Soviet leader, the Reichstag was a symbol. Taking the Reichstag meant conquering Berlin. Conquering Berlin meant destroying the Nazi regime. This fixation cost Soviet lives heavily. The Reichstag had no strategic value whatsoever. It was a largely empty shell of a building, but Stalin demanded it be taken by May 1st, the sacred day of communism. So, Soviet commanders ordered the assault regardless of cost. On the afternoon of April 28th, Soviet forces attacked the Reichstag directly. The approach was across open ground, and German forces had excellent fields of fire. The Zoo Tower, 2 kilometers away, could depress its massive 12.8 centimeter anti-aircraft guns to fire directly at Soviet infantry crossing the open areas. During daylight hours on April 30th, Soviet forces could not advance across the killing ground in front of the Reichstag because of this devastating fire. But Soviet forces persisted. They attacked at night. They used overwhelming artillery barrages to suppress German fire. They threw infantry at the building in wave after wave, accepting horrific casualties to reach their objective. On April 30th, elements of the 3rd Shock Army finally broke into the Reichstag building and engaged in room-to-room combat with SS defenders. The fighting was desperate and close quarters. Grenades exploded in hallways, machine guns chattered in stairwells, men grappled hand-to-hand. Slowly, methodically, Soviet forces cleared the building. Late in the evening of April 30th, Soviet soldiers fought their way to the roof. There, at approximately 10:50 p.m., 2 Soviet soldiers, Melitin Kantaria and Mikhail Yegorov, raised the Soviet flag over the Reichstag. Photographs of this moment, some staged later for better propaganda effect, became iconic images of Soviet victory. For Berlin civilians huddling in shelters below, the fall of the Reichstag meant the end was very close. Some felt hope, others felt terror, all felt exhaustion. The night of April 30th to May 1st. The night was chaos. Soviet artillery fire continued throughout the darkness. The sounds of battle echoed through shattered streets. In cellars and shelters across Berlin, civilians tried to sleep, tried to comfort children, tried to maintain sanity in an insane situation. In some areas, German soldiers simply gave up. They abandoned their positions and tried to escape. Many attempted to break out to the west, hoping to surrender to American forces rather than Soviets. Most never made it. Soviet forces cut them down or captured them. In other areas, fanatical defenders fought on. SS units continued resistance even when surrounded and outgunned. Some Hitler Youth, indoctrinated since childhood, fought with suicidal determination. The Nazi Party had created flying courts of war, mobile execution squads that roamed Berlin looking for deserters or anyone displaying white flags. These squads shot men on sight and left their bodies hanging from lampposts as warnings. For civilians, the night brought new terrors. As Soviet forces advanced into new neighborhoods, the pattern repeated. Soldiers searched cellars and apartments for German fighters. They looted anything of value, and they raped women on a massive scale. The rape of German women by Soviet soldiers during the fall of Berlin represents one of the war's most horrific chapters. Historians estimate that up to 100,000 women were raped in Berlin during April and May 1945. Some estimates suggest 2 million German women were raped across all Soviet-occupied territories. The violence was widespread and systematic, though not officially sanctioned. Women of all ages were targeted. Girls as young as 8 years old were raped. Women in their 60s and 70s were raped. Pregnancy did not protect women. Neither did injuries or illness. Many women were raped multiple times. Some were raped dozens of times over days or weeks. In many cases, rape was accompanied by murder. If a woman resisted, she might be shot or beaten to death. If family members tried to intervene, they were killed. One account describes a 13-year-old boy trying to pull a Soviet soldier off his mother. The soldier simply turned, shot the boy dead, and continued the rape. Magda Wieland, who took shelter in the cellar of her apartment house when Soviet forces arrived in her district, was raped by the first Soviet soldier to find her, a 16-year-old Central Asian. He was swooning with the idea that she would be his girlfriend, she recalled. But more soldiers came. They were quite angry and thin and without shoes. They looked hungry and hungry for a normal life. She was raped again. This one was brutal. He considered me his property. For German women, the night of April 30th to May 1st was a nightmare without end. They tried to hide. They tried to protect their daughters. Some tried to make themselves look older or sicker. Many women carried razor blades, prepared to commit suicide rather than be raped. Some did exactly that. Others made desperate calculations. They sought out Soviet officers, hoping that becoming one man's woman would protect them from being raped by dozens of soldiers. This strategy sometimes worked, creating twisted quasi-relationships between captive women and their Soviet protectors. Not all Soviet soldiers participated in the rapes. Some officers tried to maintain discipline and protect civilians, but these efforts were sporadic and often futile. The scale and organization of the sexual violence suggests, at minimum, that Soviet commanders tolerated it even if they did not explicitly order it. Konstantin Rokossovsky issued Order No. 6 attempting to direct the feelings of hatred at fighting the enemy on the battlefield, but it had little effect. Some officers who tried to stop rapes were shot by their own men or accused of bourgeois humanism and pity for the enemy, tantamount to treason. The commander of one rifle division personally shot a lieutenant who was lining up his men before a German woman spread-eagled on the ground, but such instances were rare. May 1st. The announcement day, May 1st, dawned over a Berlin wreathed in smoke. Fires burned throughout the city. The smell of cordite, burning buildings, and rotting flesh filled the air. Soviet forces controlled most of Berlin now. Only a few pockets of German resistance remained in the government district and scattered throughout the city. In the Führer bunker, the remaining staff faced their own decisions. Some attempted to break out and escape. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, tried to flee Berlin with a group including Hitler Youth leader Arthur Axmann. Bormann died during the breakout attempt, though his body was not found until 1972. Others committed suicide. General Hans Krebs and General Wilhelm Burgdorf shot themselves early on May 1st. Johannes Henschel, the bunker's master electrician, stayed behind to keep the power and water running for the field hospital above. He surrendered to Soviet forces when they arrived on May 2nd. Throughout May 1st, Soviet forces continued mopping up remaining German resistance. The fighting was sporadic but still deadly. In one incident, a Soviet soldier named Shuljanov, who had just been named Hero of the Soviet Union for destroying German assault guns with captured Panzerfausts, was killed by a sniper in civilian clothes, probably a Volkssturm member. In the Anhalter Bahnhof area, the SS evacuated a high-rise bunker, driving thousands of old people, women, and children through the connected commuter train tunnels toward Friedrichstrasse and Stettiner Station. The conditions were horrific. People were packed into dark, damp tunnels with no food or water, driven forward by SS troops who saw civilians as obstacles to their own survival. Across Berlin, the normal social order had completely collapsed. With law enforcement gone and the city in chaos, civilians turned to looting. They broke into stalled freight trains and marshalling yards, emptying them of foodstuffs. They raided markets and department stores. People emerged with canned goods, chocolate, tobacco, and anything else that had value. For hungry and desperate Berliners, it was survival. Stores that still had owners sold goods at bargain prices, knowing that money would soon be worthless and anything left would be looted by Soviet soldiers. The illusion of normal commerce existed alongside utter breakdown. Late in the evening of May 1st, German radio finally broadcast the announcement about Hitler's death. For most Berliners, this was the first they heard that their Führer was gone. The reaction, as noted earlier, varied tremendously, but practical concerns overwhelmed abstract politics for most people. Hitler was dead. So what? Would that stop the artillery? Would that prevent rape? Would that bring food? May 2nd, the surrender. By the early morning hours of May 6, General Helmut Weidling, the commander of the Berlin defense area, knew the end had come. His forces were out of ammunition. They were out of food. They were out of hope. Continued resistance meant more death for no purpose. At 1 a.m. on May, staff officers woke Soviet General Chuikov to inform him that the 56th Panzer Corps was requesting a ceasefire. Weidling was told to come under a white flag to the Potsdamer Bridge. He arrived there at 6 a.m. and was taken to Chuikov's headquarters. Chuikov's headquarters was in a ground-floor apartment of a Berlin apartment building at Schulenburg Ring 2 in Tempelhof. Chuikov had chosen a traditional Berlin apartment rather than any official building. In the apartment of a civilian woman named Annie Goebbels, General Weidling signed the order of surrender to all soldiers of the Berlin garrison. The surrender document ordered all German forces in Berlin to cease fighting immediately. It informed them that further resistance was useless and would only result in more casualties. It told them to lay down their weapons and present themselves for capture. The order was broadcast via radio and loudspeaker. It was posted on walls throughout the German-held portions of the city. Some German soldiers obeyed immediately, relieved that the ordeal was finally over. They walked out of their positions, hands raised, weapons abandoned, and surrendered to Soviet forces. Others refused to accept defeat. Some SS units continued fighting, even after the surrender order. They knew that as SS members, they faced execution if captured. Some chose to die fighting rather than surrender. Others committed suicide. Most, however, were killed in the final hours of fighting, or captured and executed shortly after. On the night of May 1st, most of the remaining German soldiers in the government district had attempted a breakout to escape westward. Few succeeded. Soviet forces surrounded the area and cut them down. Thousands were killed in the attempt. Thousands more were captured. For Berlin's civilians, the morning of May brought a strange combination of relief and terror. The fighting was over. The artillery had stopped. The sounds of battle that had filled their ears for weeks finally ceased. But what came next? Soviet forces were now completely in control. German soldiers who surrendered were marched off to prisoner of war camps. Most would not return for years. Many would never return at all. Civilians emerged slowly from their shelters. They blinked in the daylight, many of them seeing the sun for the first time in weeks. They looked at their city and saw devastation on an incomprehensible scale. Over 90% of Berlin's center was rubble. Bodies lay everywhere. The stench was overwhelming. An estimated 125,000 civilians died during the Battle of Berlin. Some were killed by artillery, some by sniper fire, some crushed when buildings collapsed. Approximately 6,000 committed suicide. About 20,000 died of heart attacks from stress. Many thousands more were killed by Soviet forces, either deliberately or as collateral damage, and the rapes continued. In fact, for many women, May 2nd and the days following were when the worst assaults occurred. With the fighting ended, Soviet rear echelon troops entered Berlin. These soldiers, often lacking the battle discipline of frontline units, were particularly brutal. The mass rape continued for days, then weeks, then months. It would not significantly diminish until late 1945 and would not truly end until Soviet occupation forces were finally confined to strictly guarded posts in 1947-48. Part 13, Flooding the U-Bahn. On May 2nd, after the surrender was signed, the SS committed one final senseless act of destruction. In the early morning hours, with the fighting essentially over, SS troops blew up the commuter train tunnel under the Landwehr Canal. Water from the canal flooded into the tunnel system, then spread throughout Berlin's underground transport network in the city center. Fortunately, most civilians had already evacuated from the tunnels, but people still died in the flooding. The exact number will never be known. Some drowned when water rushed into areas where they sheltered. Others were trapped and perished. The flooding also destroyed crucial infrastructure and made recovery efforts more difficult in the coming weeks. This act encapsulated the senseless destruction that characterized the final days of Nazi Germany. With the war already lost, with surrender already signed, The SS still destroyed infrastructure that would be needed by the surviving population. It served no military purpose. It achieved nothing except more suffering and death. The immediate aftermath. The days following the surrender were, in some ways, worse than the battle itself. The fighting had ended, but the dying continued. Food was scarce to non-existent. By June 1945, 1 month after the surrender, the average Berliner received only 64% of the officially calculated minimum daily calorie need of 240 calories. People were starving. Children begged for food from Soviet soldiers. Some soldiers shared their rations, others did not. More than 1 million Berliners were homeless. They lived in cellars of destroyed buildings, in makeshift shelters, in any space that offered protection from the elements. Disease spread rapidly in these conditions. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis killed thousands in the months after the fighting stopped. The Soviet occupation was harsh. Soviet soldiers continued to loot systematically. They confiscated watches from every German they encountered. They took bicycles, radios, anything of value or use. They ransacked homes and businesses. What they could not carry, they often destroyed. Soviet military administration eventually tried to restore some order and begin feeding the population, but the scale of destruction overwhelmed their efforts. Berlin was a dead city trying to come back to life. It would take years, decades even, before Berlin recovered from those terrible weeks of April and May 1945. The broader suicide wave. The suicide epidemic that peaked during these 48 hours was not confined to Berlin. Across Germany, in every area overrun by Allied forces, but especially in Soviet-occupied territories, Germans killed themselves in unprecedented numbers. Statistics from 1945 show that 5 times more Germans committed suicide that year than in any previous year in modern German history. In Berlin alone, over 7,000 suicides were officially recorded, though the real number was certainly higher. Throughout Germany, estimates suggest tens of thousands took their own lives in the war's final months. The town of Leipzig in Saxony saw mass suicides when American forces approached. When U.S. troops entered the town hall, they found the Nazi city treasurer, his wife, and his daughter all dead by suicide. Similar scenes played out in towns and cities across Germany. The patterns were consistent. Nazi officials committed suicide to avoid capture and trial. Military officers killed themselves to avoid Soviet captivity. Ordinary civilians, especially in areas being occupied by Soviet forces, chose death over an uncertain future. Some of the explanations for this mass suicide phenomenon relate to Nazi ideology itself. The Nazi regime had glorified the concept of heroic death. It had promoted the idea that death was preferable to defeat. It had created a cult around sacrifice and martyrdom. When the Reich collapsed, these ideological constructs translated into action for tens of thousands of people. Fear of Soviet revenge was rational, not paranoid. The Soviets had suffered unimaginable losses at German hands. Over 25 million Soviet citizens died during the war. German forces had committed horrific atrocities in the Soviet Union, including mass executions of civilians, systematic starvation, and participation in the Holocaust. Soviet soldiers knew what had been done to their country, and they wanted revenge. Nazi propaganda had spent years telling Germans about Soviet barbarism. Some of this was exaggeration and lies, but much of it was based in reality. When Soviet forces actually arrived, the propaganda was validated by experience. Women were raped, men were executed or shipped to labor camps, property was looted. The worst fears came true. For many Germans, especially those deeply invested in Nazi ideology, the collapse of the Third Reich represented a total loss of meaning. If the Reich was defeated, if Hitler was dead, if the Nazi dream was over, then what was the point of living? Their entire worldview collapsed. Some chose death rather than face a world where everything they believed was proven false. The children. Among the most heartbreaking aspects of this period were the children. Tens of thousands of German children experienced the fall of Berlin and the occupation. What they saw and endured would traumatize them for life. Children watched their parents killed. They watched their mothers raped. They were themselves victims of violence. Some were shot by nervous or vengeful Soviet soldiers. Some died in artillery barrages. Some starved. The murder-suicides were particularly tragic. Parents who chose to kill their children before killing themselves believed they were protecting them from a worse fate. They could not imagine a future worth living for their children, so they ended their lives. Magda Goebbels drugged her 6 children, then gave them cyanide. The children died in their bunker beds. Their ages were 12, 11, 9, 7, 5, and 4. They had no choice in the matter. Their mother made the decision for them. Throughout Berlin and Germany, parents made similar choices. They poisoned their children. They shot them. They drowned them. They believed they were showing mercy. The horror of this cannot be overstated. Other children survived but were left orphaned. With parents dead or disappeared, they wandered the ruins of Berlin, begging for food, searching for shelter. Some were taken in by other families. Some were placed in orphanages. Some simply died on the streets. The Hitler Youth who had been sent into battle, some as young as 12 years old, faced particular trauma. They had been indoctrinated to die for Hitler and the Reich. Many fought with fanatical determination. Some survived to face the reality that they had been manipulated and used by adults who sent children to die for a lost cause. What they said. What did Berlin civilians actually say during these 48 hours? Documentary evidence gives us glimpses into their thoughts and words. In cellars and shelters, people whispered to each other. They speculated about when it would end. They comforted children. They prayed, even those who had not been religious before. Some maintained black humor as a coping mechanism. Others fell silent, retreating into themselves. When will the Americans get here? This question was asked over and over on ration lines and in shelters. The hope was that American forces would reach Berlin before the Soviets. Americans were seen as less likely to commit atrocities. This hope was misplaced. American forces had no intention of fighting their way into Berlin. They had agreed to let the Soviets take the city. It cannot get worse than this. People said this to reassure themselves and others. They were often wrong. It could get worse, and frequently did. At least when the Russians come, the bombing will stop. This was true. Soviet forces did not bomb areas they controlled. But the relief from aerial bombardment was replaced by artillery bombardment and then by occupation. When the news of Hitler's death finally reached civilians, their comments reflected varied perspectives. Some true believers wept. The Führer has fallen, they cried, genuinely grieving. Others were more pragmatic. Now perhaps it will end. And some were cynical. Good riddance. After the surrender, when people emerged from shelters, their words reflected shock at the scale of destruction. There is nothing left. Everything is gone. We have lost everything. These phrases captured the sense of total devastation. Women who had been raped mostly said nothing. There was a conspiracy of silence around the sexual violence. Speaking about it openly risked being shamed or rejected. One saying emerged, "We service the Russians now, and we women will have to keep silent, or no man will ever want to touch us again." The anonymous Berlin diarist, a journalist whose account was published decades later, captured the dark humor and desperate pragmatism of women trying to survive. She wrote about seeking a Soviet officer as a protector, trading sex for safety. She wrote about the absurdity of trying to maintain dignity in undignified circumstances. Her diary entries from these days show resilience, horror, pragmatism, and trauma, all mixed together. The international reaction. While Berlin burned and its civilians suffered, the world reacted to news of Hitler's death with a mixture of jubilation, skepticism, and political calculation. In Britain and the United States, the news was met with celebration. In London, crowds gathered spontaneously. In New York's Times Square, people danced. The tyrant was dead. Victory was certain now, but Allied leaders were cautious. Was Hitler really dead? The Nazis had lied so often that skepticism was warranted. Stalin himself, when informed of Hitler's death by Marshal Zhukov, responded calmly, but asked, "Where's Hitler's corpse?" The Soviet leader wanted proof. Over the following months, conflicting reports emerged. Some claimed Hitler had escaped. Others said he was wounded and had been evacuated. The Soviets themselves promulgated various stories, some suggesting Hitler had fled to the West and was being protected by British or American intelligence. This confusion was partly deliberate Soviet disinformation and partly genuine uncertainty. The Soviets did find Hitler's dental remains and confirmed his death through his dentist's records. But Stalin chose to keep this information classified for political purposes. The uncertainty about Hitler's fate could be exploited to maintain vigilance against Nazi remnants. In Germany itself, the reaction to Hitler's death varied by region and circumstance. In areas occupied by Western allies, the news was met with relief. The war would end soon. Perhaps reconstruction could begin. In Soviet-occupied areas, the news was overshadowed by the immediate reality of occupation. The propaganda's last gasp. Even as Berlin fell and Hitler's death was announced, Nazi propaganda continued. The announcement itself, calling Hitler's suicide a hero's death fighting Bolshevism, was propaganda. Donitz's promise to continue fighting was propaganda. The regime lied until its very last moments. Some Nazi propaganda materials portrayed Hitler's death as martyrdom. He had given his life for Germany, they claimed. He had fought to the bitter end. This narrative served multiple purposes. It attempted to maintain morale among remaining German forces. It tried to create a myth around Hitler that could survive his physical death. And it deflected from the reality that Hitler had killed himself in despair after leading Germany to catastrophic defeat. The propaganda also emphasized the threat of Bolshevism. Donitz's announcement stressed that the fight against Bolshevism must continue. This message aimed to justify continued German resistance and to appeal to Western powers, suggesting that Germans and Western allies should unite against the Soviet threat. It was a cynical attempt to split the Allied coalition. For Berlin civilians, the propaganda was irrelevant. They had lived through years of propaganda, telling them victory was certain, that wonder weapons would turn the tide, that relief forces were coming. None of it had been true. Now, propaganda said their Führer had died heroically. They knew better. Nothing Hitler or his regime said mattered anymore. Only survival mattered, Soviet victory and German defeat. On May 2, 1945, Berlin officially fell to the Soviet Union. The battle had lasted 16 days, from April 16th when the bombardment began to May 5th when organized resistance ended. The cost in lives was staggering. Soviet forces suffered approximately 81,000 killed and another 280,000 wounded during the operation. These figures included the battles for the Seelow Heights, the encirclement of Berlin, and the city fighting itself. The Soviets also lost nearly 2,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. German military casualties are harder to quantify with precision. Estimates suggest approximately 92,000 to 100,000 German soldiers were killed. Another 20,000 were wounded. Hundreds of thousands more were captured and marched off to Soviet POW camps. Many of these prisoners would not return home for a decade. The last German prisoners of war held by the Soviet Union were not released until 1954, nearly 9 years after the war ended. Civilian casualties in Berlin numbered at least 125,000 killed. This includes about 22,000 in the city proper, according to some estimates, with others suggesting much higher numbers. The causes of civilian death were diverse. Artillery killed tens of thousands. Bombing killed many more. Approximately 6,000 committed suicide. Around 20,000 died of heart attacks or stress-related conditions. Soviet forces killed thousands more, either deliberately or as collateral damage. Some died of starvation or disease. For the Soviet Union, the fall of Berlin represented the culmination of nearly 4 years of brutal fighting on the Eastern Front. Over 25 million Soviet citizens died in World War II, roughly half of all war deaths worldwide. The capture of Berlin was revenge for Leningrad, for Stalingrad, for thousands of destroyed villages and murdered civilians. It was also validation of the Soviet Union's sacrifice and proof that the Red Army had destroyed the Nazi regime. For Germany, May 2, 1945, marked the effective end of the Third Reich. Hitler's promised 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years. It ended not in glory, but in rubble, blood, and shame. The Nazi dream of racial supremacy and Germanic domination collapsed into a nightmare of defeat, occupation, and devastation. The week after, the surrender of Berlin did not immediately end the war. Admiral Dönitz, whom Hitler had named as his successor, continued to govern what remained of the German state from Flensburg in the north. German forces continued fighting in other theaters, particularly attempting to hold lines against the Soviets while allowing Western advances, hoping to surrender to British and American forces rather than Soviets. On May 4th, German forces in northwest Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands surrendered to British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. About 1 million German troops laid down their arms. On May 7th, at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Reims, France, Colonel General Alfred Jodl signed the German Instrument of Surrender, an unconditional surrender to all Allied forces. The surrender was to take effect at 11:01 p.m. on May 8, 1945. The Soviets insisted on a second surrender ceremony in Berlin. On May 8th, in Karlshorst in eastern Berlin, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed a ratified surrender document at Soviet headquarters. This ceremony was attended by representatives of all four major Allied powers. May 8, 1945, became known as Victory in Europe Day. In the United States and Britain, crowds celebrated in the streets. In Moscow, Stalin declared victory. In Berlin, Soviet soldiers celebrated, while German civilians tried to comprehend their new reality. But for Berlin civilians, the week after May brought no celebration. They were occupied, they were hungry, they were traumatized. The nightmare of war had ended, but the nightmare of occupation was just beginning. Long-term consequences. The 48 hours between Hitler's death and Berlin's surrender marked a turning point, not just in the war, but in human history. The fall of Berlin effectively ended World War II in Europe. Within a week, all German forces surrendered. Within months, the focus shifted to defeating Japan and to planning the post-war world. The division of Berlin and Germany between Allied powers began immediately. Berlin was divided into four sectors: Soviet, American, British, and French. This division would become permanent with the onset of the Cold War. Berlin remained a divided city until 1989, when the Berlin Wall finally fell. For the women who survived the mass rapes, the trauma lasted a lifetime. Many could never speak about what happened to them. Those who became pregnant faced impossible choices. Abortions, normally illegal in Germany, were temporarily allowed. Many women chose to terminate pregnancies resulting from rape. Others gave birth to children conceived in violence, facing social stigma and personal anguish. The suicide epidemic left psychological scars across German society. Families lost members not to war, but to despair. Children lost parents who chose death. The scale of self-destruction spoke to the utter collapse of meaning and hope that characterized Nazi Germany's end. The destruction of Berlin was almost total. Rebuilding would take decades. Some areas remained in ruins into the 1960s. The psychological reconstruction took even longer. How does a society rebuild not just buildings, but identity after such catastrophic moral and material failure? The German historical memory of this period is complex and contested. For decades, Germans focused on their victimization, the bombing, the occupation, the rapes, the suffering. This narrative was incomplete and sometimes served to obscure or minimize German responsibility for the war and the Holocaust. More recent historical work has attempted to provide fuller context, acknowledging German suffering while not forgetting German crimes. Historical significance. The 48 hours between Hitler's death and Berlin's surrender represent a microcosm of World War II's end in Europe. They contain all the war's themes: ideological fanaticism, mass violence, civilian suffering, the collapse of social order, revenge, and the struggle for survival in circumstances beyond imagining. These hours also demonstrate how individuals respond when political and social structures completely fail. Some people maintain their humanity, helping neighbors, protecting children, showing kindness in impossible circumstances. Others descended into barbarism, committing acts of violence and cruelty. Most did whatever they needed to do to survive, making choices they never imagined they would face. The mass suicide phenomenon is historically unprecedented. No other modern society has experienced anything comparable. It suggests how deeply Nazi ideology had penetrated German consciousness and how completely the Nazi state had bound German identity to Hitler personally and to the idea of German victory. When both Hitler and victory were gone, tens of thousands chose death rather than face a world where their fundamental beliefs had been proven false. The treatment of German women by Soviet forces represents one of history's great crimes. While it occurred in the context of a brutal war that Germany had started, and while German forces had committed similar and worse crimes in the Soviet Union, the mass rape of German women was a humanitarian catastrophe. The fact that it went largely unacknowledged for decades speaks to the shame and silence that surrounded sexual violence. The civilian experience in Berlin during these 48 hours also demonstrates the ultimate failure of total war ideology. The Nazi regime had mobilized German society completely for war. It had propagandized the population into supporting aggressive warfare and accepting totalitarian control. In the end, this total mobilization led to total destruction. The German people, who had been promised greatness, received instead rubble and ruin. Survivor testimonies. Those who lived through these 48 hours carried the memories for the rest of their lives. In the decades after the war, some survivors gave testimony about their experiences. Judah Petinati, who sheltered in a university basement, later recalled the sense of unreality. The sun was shining, she said, as if it didn't care for all the chaos on Earth. This disconnect between the beauty of a spring day and the horror all around captured the surreal quality of those hours. Magda Frintrop, who was raped multiple times by Soviet soldiers, still lived in the same apartment building on Giesebrechtstrasse 10 when interviewed decades later. She was vital and expressive at 81, but the memories remained sharp and painful. "I was completely alone," she recalled. "It was horrible." Other testimonies came from children who were young at the time. They remembered hiding in basements, hearing their mothers' screams, seeing bodies in the streets. They remembered hunger so intense it consumed all other thoughts. They remembered Soviet soldiers who were kind, and others who were monsters. They remembered parents who tried to maintain normalcy in circumstances where nothing was normal. Some survivors chose silence. They could not or would not speak about what they experienced. The trauma was too great, the shame too intense, or perhaps words seemed inadequate to capture what they had lived through. The bunker after Hitler. When Soviet forces finally captured the Reich Chancellery on May 2nd, they found the Führer bunker mostly abandoned. The bodies of Joseph and Magda Goebbels and their 6 children were found on May 3rd. The children showed the clear marks of cyanide poisoning on their faces. Hitler's body was never found by Western forces. Soviet intelligence units had secretly recovered burnt remains they believed to be Hitler and Eva Braun on May 4th. Dental records confirmed the identification, but the Soviets kept this information classified. The remains were moved multiple times over the following years. In 1946, they were buried at a Smersh facility in Magdeburg. In 1970, concerned that the burial site might become a neo-Nazi shrine, KGB Director Yuri Andropov authorized an operation to exhume and thoroughly cremate the remains. On April 4, 1970, the ashes were cast into the Biederitz River, a tributary of the Elbe. The Führer bunker itself remained largely intact immediately after the war. Allied officers and journalists toured it in the weeks and months following Berlin's fall. Winston Churchill visited on July 14, 1945. American photographer William Vandiver documented the bunker interior shortly after the surrender. These photographs showed a surreal underground world where history's most consequential evil had met its end. Over time, the bunker was filled in and covered over. The German government deliberately ensured that nothing would mark the spot. No memorial, no plaque, no marker. Today, the location is an ordinary parking lot and apartment complex. Most people who walk over it have no idea what lies buried beneath their feet. Historical documentation. The documentation of these 48 hours comes from multiple sources. Soviet military archives provide detailed accounts of the fighting and occupation, though these were classified for decades and some remain restricted. German military records, where they survived, offer the defenders' perspective. Civilian diaries and memoirs, often written years after the events, provide personal accounts. The most famous civilian account is the anonymous diary of a Berlin woman, published in English as A Woman in Berlin. This journalist's diary covers the period from April 20th to June 22, 1945, and provides unflinching detail about life in the occupied city, including her own rapes and her decision to take a Soviet officer as a protector. Nazi Party documents and propaganda materials from the period show the regime's final attempts to maintain control and shape the narrative. Radio transcripts preserve the announcements of Hitler's death and the surrender orders. Photographs and film footage captured by both Soviet and Western photographers documented the physical destruction. Images of Berlin in May 1945 show a cityscape of utter devastation. Buildings reduced to shells, streets filled with rubble, bodies lying unburied, Soviet soldiers raising the red flag over the Reichstag. Testimonies gathered for war crimes trials, particularly the Nuremberg trials, provided additional documentation. Nazi officials who survived and were tried gave accounts of the regime's final days. Soviet atrocities were less well documented at these trials for political reasons, but evidence emerged over time. Comparison to other cities. Berlin's experience was not unique, though its scale and significance were exceptional. Many German cities experienced similar sequences of battle, occupation, and suffering as Allied forces advanced. Dresden had been devastated by Allied firebombing in February 1945, killing tens of thousands of civilians. Hamburg had suffered similar destruction in 1943. Cologne, Frankfurt, Munich, and dozens of other German cities were bombed into rubble. But Berlin's fall carried special significance because it was the capital, because Hitler died there, and because the Battle of Berlin was the last major engagement of the European war. Berlin's fall meant the war's end in a way that other cities' falls did not. The Soviet treatment of German civilians in Berlin was representative of their treatment of Germans throughout the territory they occupied. Mass rape, looting, and violence occurred in every area Red Army forces entered. The pattern established in Berlin played out across East Prussia, Pomerania, Silesia, and other eastern territories. In areas occupied by Western forces, the treatment of German civilians was generally less brutal, though not without problems. American, British, and French soldiers also committed rapes and other crimes, but not on the systematic scale of Soviet forces. Food and living conditions were typically better in Western-occupied zones. The children of rape. One long-lasting consequence of the mass rapes was the children conceived through sexual violence. Estimates vary, but historians believe that tens of thousands of children were born in Germany in late 1945 and early 1946 as a result of Soviet soldiers raping German women. These children faced difficult lives. Some mothers chose abortion, others gave birth but gave the children up for adoption. Still others raised children who were constant reminders of trauma. The children themselves often faced stigma and identity questions. Some mothers loved and cared for these children, despite the circumstances of their conception. Others struggled with resentment and rejection. The children, when they learned the truth of their origins, faced their own trauma and identity crises. The Soviet government never acknowledged the scale of sexual violence its soldiers committed. In Soviet and later Russian historical narratives, the mass rapes were either denied, minimized, or justified as revenge for German crimes. This refusal to acknowledge the crime added another layer of suffering for the victims and their children. The physical reconstruction. The physical reconstruction of Berlin began almost immediately after the surrender, but it would take decades to complete. The scale of destruction was difficult to comprehend. An estimated 75 million cubic meters of rubble filled Berlin's streets and covered what had been buildings. Women, nicknamed Trümmerfrauen or rubble women, formed human chains to clear debris piece by piece. With most men dead, imprisoned, or absent, women did the backbreaking work of cleaning up the city. They worked for minimal pay, often just for food rations, sorting bricks and removing rubble by hand. The division of Berlin between Allied powers complicated reconstruction. Each sector followed different plans and priorities. The Soviet sector, which became East Berlin, was rebuilt according to communist principles. The Western sectors, which became West Berlin, followed capitalist models. This division became permanent when Germany was split into two countries in 1949. Some ruins remained for years. The bombed-out Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church was left partially destroyed as a memorial to war. Other damaged buildings were simply abandoned, left as shells amid the slowly rebuilding city. Infrastructure reconstruction took years. Electricity, water, and sewage systems had to be completely rebuilt in many areas. Transportation infrastructure had been destroyed and needed reconstruction. The U-Bahn tunnels, flooded in the war's final hours, took months to drain and repair. Psychological impact. The psychological impact of these 48 hours and the Battle of Berlin extended far beyond the immediate participants. An entire generation of Germans grew up with trauma as their childhood reality. For children who experienced the fall of Berlin, the psychological scars lasted lifetimes. Studies of this generation show higher rates of anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Many struggled with relationships, trust, and emotional regulation throughout their lives. Women who were raped often never spoke about it. The shame and stigma were too great. Many developed what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, though that diagnosis did not exist at the time. Depression, anxiety, nightmares, and flashbacks were common. Suicide rates among rape survivors remained elevated for years. Men who fought in Berlin's defense and survived faced their own trauma. Many had witnessed horrific violence. Many had committed acts they could never reconcile with their self-image. The cognitive dissonance of having fought for an evil cause while believing they were defending their homes and families created lasting psychological conflict. The mass suicide phenomenon left psychological scars on survivors. Families where parents had attempted but failed to kill their children faced complicated dynamics of betrayal and trauma. Children who were orphaned when parents chose suicide struggled with abandonment and rejection. Communities dealing with mass death by suicide faced collective trauma. The memory wars, how Germany remembered and interpreted these 48 hours and the Battle of Berlin has changed over time and has been politically contested. In the immediate post-war years, Germans emphasized their own suffering. The bombing, the battle, the rapes, and the occupation were discussed as German victimization. This narrative served to deflect from German responsibility for the war and the Holocaust. In East Germany, the communist government promoted a narrative where anti-fascist Germans had resisted the Nazis, and Soviet forces had liberated Germany from fascism. The mass rapes were denied or minimized. Soviet soldiers were portrayed exclusively as heroes and liberators. In West Germany, the focus gradually shifted to confronting Nazi crimes and German responsibility. The question of German suffering became more complicated. How could Germans be victims when they had started the war and committed unprecedented crimes? Since German reunification in 1990, historical work has attempted to provide more complete and nuanced accounts. Historians like Antony Beevor have documented Soviet crimes while maintaining context about German crimes. Films like Downfall and A Woman in Berlin have dramatized the period, making it accessible to new generations. Controversies continue. Some argue that focusing on German suffering minimizes German crimes and serves right-wing political agendas. Others argue that acknowledging German suffering is necessary for complete historical understanding and for recognizing the humanity of all victims. The mass rapes in particular have been contested terrain. Feminist historians have worked to document and analyze the sexual violence, arguing that women's experiences must be acknowledged regardless of political context. Others worry that emphasizing Soviet crimes feeds into Cold War-era propaganda narratives. The individuals behind the statistics and historical analysis were millions of individual human beings, each with their own story. Let me share just a few. Hannelore Kohl, who would become the wife of German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, was 12 years old when she was gang raped by Soviet soldiers in May 1945. She was thrown out of a first-floor window, sustaining a serious back injury that caused pain and illness for her entire life. The trauma of her experience contributed to lifelong mental health struggles. In 2001, she took her own life. Łukasz Miś was a Polish-born SS soldier who served as Hitler's bodyguard and telecommunications operator in the Führer bunker for 5 years. He was one of the last people to see Hitler alive. After Hitler's death, Miś attempted to break out of Berlin with others from the bunker. He was captured by Soviet forces and spent 9 years in Soviet prisoner of war camps before being released in 1953. He died in 2013 at age 96, one of the last living witnesses to Hitler's final days. Traudl Junge was one of Hitler's secretaries. She was with him in the bunker during the final days and took dictation of his will and political testament on April 29th. After Hitler's death, she escaped the bunker and eventually surrendered to Soviet forces. She spent years trying to understand how she had served such an evil regime. Her testimony provided crucial details about Hitler's death and the bunker's final days. Dieter Borkowski was a teenage boy in Berlin during the battle. He later wrote about his experiences hiding in cellars, searching for food, and witnessing Soviet soldiers' treatment of civilians. His account provides a child's perspective on the chaos and terror of those days. Countless other individuals experienced these 48 hours, each with their own fear, choices, and consequences. Mothers trying to protect their children, soldiers deciding whether to fight or surrender, women choosing how to survive occupation, old men wondering why they had not died earlier. young women whose lives were forever changed by violence. The final assessment. The 48 hours between Hitler's death on April 30th and Berlin's surrender on May 2nd, 1945, represent a unique moment in history where an evil regime's end collided with human suffering on a massive scale. What did Berlin civilians say when Hitler died? Some grieved, some celebrated. Most were too overwhelmed by immediate concerns to care much about abstract political symbolism. They said, "Is it over?" And "What happens now?" And "How will we survive?" They said, "Please don't hurt us," and "I have children," and "We have no food." They said, "Thank God it's ending," and "I wish I was dead." The chaos of those hours defies easy summary. Thousands committed suicide, hundreds of thousands were raped, tens of thousands were killed in the final fighting, or executed after surrendering. Millions suffered hunger, fear, and trauma. The city itself was destroyed beyond recognition. But the human capacity for resilience also shone through. People helped each other, strangers shared food, families protected each other. Small acts of kindness occurred alongside great cruelty. Humanity persisted even in the most inhumane circumstances. The fall of Berlin marked the end of history's most destructive war in Europe. Over 60 million people had died worldwide. Entire cities had been destroyed. Political and social systems had collapsed. The Holocaust had murdered 6 million Jews and millions of others. The world had been fundamentally changed. These 48 hours were a microcosm of all that the war represented: human evil, human suffering, human endurance. They showed what happens when ideology becomes more important than humanity, when power becomes absolute, and when war is total. For Berlin's civilians, May 2, 1945 was not VE Day. It was not a day of celebration. It was the day their city officially died, even as they tried to survive to see what would come next. The broader context, to fully understand what Berlin civilians said and experienced during these 48 hours, we must remember what came before and what came after. These civilians had lived through years of Nazi rule. Some had enthusiastically supported the regime. Others had quietly resisted or tried to survive. Most had occupied an uncomfortable middle ground, accepting the benefits of Nazi rule while ignoring or minimizing its crimes. They had lived through World War II, initially experiencing victory and pride, then gradual decline, and finally catastrophic defeat. They had experienced years of Allied bombing that destroyed their city. They had lost family members on distant fronts. They had known hunger, fear, and deprivation. Now, in these final 48 hours, everything came crashing down. The regime they had lived under was ending. Their city was being conquered. Their future was uncertain. The psychological whiplash was enormous. After May 2nd, they would live through occupation, division, Cold War tensions, and eventually reunification. Berlin would be a divided city for 4 years, a symbol of global ideological conflict. The trauma of these 48 hours would echo through German society for generations. The 48 hours between Hitler's death and Berlin's surrender were among the most consequential in modern history. They marked the effective end of Nazi Germany and World War II in Europe. They witnessed unprecedented violence, trauma, and human suffering. They demonstrated both the worst and occasionally the best of human nature under extreme circumstances. What did Berlin civilians say when Hitler died? They said many things, or nothing at all. Their words and silences reflected the complexity of human experience in impossible situations. They grieved, hoped, despaired, endured, and tried to survive. These 48 hours remind us of war's ultimate costs. Not just the battles and the military casualties, but the civilians caught in the crossfire, the women violated, the children traumatized, the families destroyed. They remind us that total war means total destruction, and that the consequences of political evil extend far beyond those who commit it to engulf entire societies. The civilians of Berlin during those 48 hours were not heroes or villains. They were human beings trying to survive in circumstances beyond their control or imagination. Their experiences deserve to be remembered, not to excuse German crimes or minimize Nazi evil, but to acknowledge the full human cost of the war and to remind us why such things must never happen again. On April 30th, 1945, at 3:30 p.m., Adolf Hitler died by his own hand. 48 hours later, on May 2nd, 1945, at approximately 3 o'clock p.m., General Helmuth Weidling signed the surrender order that ended the Battle of Berlin. In those 48 hours, a world ended, and a new one began to emerge from the rubble. The Berlin civilians who lived through those hours carried their memories for the rest of their lives. Their testimonies, their silence, their survival, and their losses are part of history. This is their story. This is what they said when Hitler died.